Good evening. My name is Diermeier. I'm the Provost of the University of Chicago, and until 3 months ago, the Dean of the Harris School of Public Policy. I'm delighted to welcome you to our event tonight. It's such a pleasure to see so many of our alumni, students, faculty, staff, and supporters with us this evening. We're here today to celebrate the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy's impact in the world and its future home, the Keller Center. Today, we also mark an important anniversary. Exactly 1 year ago to the day, we had the great privilege of announcing the creation of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict and the Pearson Global Forum. And I'm particularly pleased that Timothy R. Pearson is in attendance this evening, and I'm grateful to him and his brother, Thomas L. Pearson, and the Pearson Family Members Foundation for placing their trust in the University of Chicago to tackle the most important policy challenge of our time. A year later, we have more to celebrate. Our dream of a new building that better embodies the Harris School's and the Pearson Institute's mission is now becoming a reality. Work on the Keller Center has begun, and it is scheduled to open in the fall of 2018. Its design reflects the identity of the school, dedicated to data-driven policy innovation. These are exciting times for Harris as we begin to realize our ambition to become the world's greatest school of public policy and be recognized as such. A school whose graduates become leaders that put evidence first, a school whose faculty develop innovative policy solutions based on the best science of its day, and a school that sets the standard for what a public policy school should be. Now, please join me in welcoming the President of the University of Chicago, Robert J. Zimmer.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. Daniel said a great deal about the aspirations of the Harris School in a very concise way, and I just want to embellish some of these remarks a little bit. First, everybody knows that the University of Chicago is focused very much on the question of evidence and argument. Everything we do has to be based on argument, has to be based on appropriate types of evidence, and that we do not accept argument without the nature of evidence. This is true for public policy schools, it's true for any other part of the university. Public policy schools, however, need to be more than that. They need to be outward-looking, they need to be actively engaged, they need to be engaging public policy leaders, they need to be producing students who will go on to be leaders who are actively engaged in this work. So not only is an analysis of evidence crucial, analysis of problems in evidence-based ways crucial, but this constant focus on outward engagement and impact becomes an intrinsic part of a public policy school. This was the dream of Irving Harris when the Harris School of Public Policy was founded. For many years, the Harris School focused very much on the academic foundations of public policy. And a number of years ago, we made a very clear decision that it was time, with all the success of those foundations in place, to fulfill what I would say is the larger and fuller mission of the Harris School, which was to create this focus on outward engagement, engaging policy leaders, producing leaders from our student body, and that we needed to take a number of steps in order to make this happen. The goal in doing this was exactly the goal that Daniel put forward, which was, with that fuller definition of what the Harris School could and should be, that it would in fact become the model of what a public policy school is and be recognized as the leading school of public policy in this country. What was necessary to do? First, we needed a leader who was going to provide the vision, and not just the vision, but the capacity to execute to move the entire enterprise forward. And we found such a person in Daniel Diermeier. We needed to recruit a collection of faculty who are going to build on the excellent faculty who are already here and expand the way that the Harris School thought about itself and the nature of its capacity. We needed to expand the student body. We needed to connect that, the Harris School, to the rest of the university, where there were so many places where the Harris School could pull in a set of expertise and contribute to a whole number of other activities within the university. We needed outstanding and energetic philanthropic support. Daniel mentioned the Pearson Institute, which was an extraordinary and wonderful gift that encapsulates the goal of addressing a fundamental problem of our times, doing it in an evidence-based way, but also doing it in a vigorously, outwardly engaged way. And finally, we needed a building, because to do all this and to represent the nature of the work that was being done and the ambition of the school, we needed a building that was going to reflect that and appropriately house that. Here again, it was philanthropy that enabled us to go ahead with this. And I, of course, particularly want to recognize here Dennis and Connie Keller, whose particular generosity to this project was the catalyst for enabling it to happen. Dennis and Connie were not the only ones who stepped up. There are others here. I don't want to name everybody, but there are a number of other people in this room who made critical commitments to enabling this project. But with this building underway and all of the other things moving forward so well, I think we can see a future of the Harris School, which is both dramatic in what Daniel said about being the greatest school of public policy and being recognized as such, but also where the future goes back to the beginning and connects and realizes the dream that Irving Harris had when this school began. So with that, I'd like to ask Dennis and Connie to come up, or are you both coming up, or? Dennis is coming up. Dennis is coming up. I want to say just one word. Dennis and Connie have been extraordinary contributors to the university across just a remarkable expanse of the university's activities. There's one critical element in their philanthropy, which is again captured by their philanthropy to the Keller Center, and that is stepping up when there's a moment when something happens, something needs to change, and where is the catalyst going to come from to enable that change? Dennis and Connie have done this before. They've done it again with the Keller Center, and so I want to thank both of them for everything they've done for the university. And with that, ask Dennis to come up and say a few words. Thank you very much.
Hello, Harris. It is wonderful to be here, and it is wonderful to find, as I did in a long, long association with this university since I was a graduate student here in the 60s, and my mother an undergraduate student here in the 20s, and in the years since, and in the years of service to the trustees, which have been so fun and exciting and fulfilling, and finding things, as Bob said, finding things where it's time for a push, where a push can really help, and that is the favorite kind of philanthropy that Connie and I try to practice, and put together a few other factors, such as the older I get, the more important I think it is that we have our best and brightest helping this country, and at all levels, local, state, national, in both policy and leadership. And I can't think of any better place to make that happen at higher and higher levels than the University of Chicago. We have this great place within Chicago, the Harris School, great students, great faculty, great way of studying and thinking about evidence and argument to make things better. So as I looked at that a few years ago, just a couple of years ago, I said, I think we have this wonderful jewel, and it needs a little more burnishing. It needs the things that Bob mentioned. So Connie and I are just as happy as we can be to be able to provide some of that and to be a part of what I know is going to be just a magnificent future for the Harris School, an absolutely magnificent future. So we are as happy as we can be. We hope you feel the same, and let's do it together. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is Kerbin Charles. I'm the interim dean at the Harris School. Dennis, I can assure you that we are as nearly as happy as you are. In fact, we're more happy than you are. We at Harris believe that there is a special distinctiveness to the Harris School that characterizes not only our rigorous approach to public policy, but also the ways in which our community of faculty, students, and staff interacts. The Keller Center will comfortably house the broad range of intellectually ambitious activities on which we've been vigorously engaged for more than 25 years. It will also accommodate the new initiatives, teaching methods, and modes of analysis that will emerge over the next quarter century. The new building's design will be a physical manifestation of our commitment to the open exchange of ideas, perhaps the core tenet of both the University of Chicago and the Harris School. As the Keller Center space was planned, we stayed true to the core beliefs of the school and used them as guideposts to connect past to future. We believe at Harris that good policy making is serious business with no shortcuts. It requires the fearless and relentless questioning of conventional wisdom. It is ideally rooted in facts and evidence. The good policymaker, we believe, courageously faces facts, gathers data on how things actually are as the basis for policymaking. From their first day here, day one, as we call it, Harris students are taught how to turn passion into proven social impact through classwork and real-world engagement, including fully taking advantage of the many opportunities in the special city in which we're located. We live in a world and at a time where the need for this perspective on policy, a point of view rooted in science and not ideology, is more urgent than ever. By creating a place that invites new ideas here to Harris, the Keller Center will help us expand our impact. I am deeply honored to lead the school at this time, and great opportunity. We're an immensely united and strong community of scholars, students, alums, I see many alums about, staff, and friends who are jointly helping to redefine what a public policy school should be for the next generation. We're the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. We could not be more proud of who we are or where we're headed.
Can we move policy beyond politics?
What if our leaders put evidence first?
How do we figure out what's best for society and get it done.
At the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, we are addressing today's most important questions using today's best science.
Can algorithms prevent police misconduct?
Does our Constitution contribute to ineffective government?
How much is clean air worth?
Why do some nations fail, but not others?
These are hard questions, and their answers won't always be popular.
But we don't think policy is about feeling good.
Policy is about doing good. It needs to get results.
At Harris, we believe there's a science to social impact.
We're serious people with the courage to find and face the facts, to take risks, challenge the status quo, and question the easy answers.
We gather and understand the data and use it to make better decisions.
We get up close to the issues, engaging with our city, our world, and our leaders every day to evaluate and test ideas.
We lead with our passion for driving social change.
And we bring the precision it takes to turn passion into measurable results.
We're making a difference at home,
In Chicago,
And around the globe.
because in a world where you can do anything, why not make it count?
This is Harris Public Policy. Social impact down to a science.
So it's now my privilege to introduce three of my faculty colleagues, Angela Adukia, William Howell, and James Robinson, who will highlight some of their research and discuss how Harris is helping shape the future of public policy. Angela Adukia is an assistant professor. Her research is focused on understanding factors that influence educational decisions and the potential role for institutions such as governments and nonprofit organizations to improve child outcomes, particularly at the intersection of education and health. Her current work examines how the provision of basic needs, such as sanitation, clothing, and housing, affects child outcomes. James Robinson is a university professor at Harris. His main research interests are in comparative economic and political development, with a focus on the long run, with a particular interest in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. He is currently conducting research in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sierra Leone, Haiti, and in Colombia, where he's taught for many years during the summer at the University of the Andes in Bogota. William Howell is the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at Harris and a professor in the Department of Political Science and the college. He has written widely on separation of powers issues and American political institutions, especially the presidency. He is currently working on research projects on Obama's education initiatives, distributive politics, and the normative foundations of executive power. Following their remarks, we'll have a brief discussion on the future of public policy, and we'll take some questions.
Good evening. My name is Anjali Adukia, and I'm an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this exciting occasion. I have long been interested in understanding and evaluating public policies that improve the lives of children. And more recently, I've been trying to understand how we teach behavior as a society. Or put differently, how punitive should we be as a society? In our homes, in our schools, in our communities? Now, some would argue that in a world where the fundamental goal is a society free of violence, no degree of punitiveness above zero is acceptable. But others may argue that the only way to serve justice is by inflicting or imposing a penalty as retribution for an offense. Certainly, this question is faced by parents when determining how to shape or perhaps respond to their children's behavior. How should one respond if a child suddenly loses control of his or her impulses or doesn't listen to his or her parent. Perhaps the greatest source of sanctioned violence in the world occurs in the home between parent and child through the use of corporal punishment, which is a discipline method in which an adult deliberately inflicts pain upon a child in response to unacceptable behavior or language. On the one hand, spanking may relieve a parent's frustration and extinguish the undesirable behavior in the moment. On the other hand, it may teach children that violence is an acceptable means to resolve conflicts or express anger, and may not teach alternative behavior. Despite opposition of its use by organizations such as the American Academy of Pediatrics or the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, no US state has banned its use in the home. By contrast, while there's often resistance to having policies dictate or determine what occurs in the home, there is less resistance to have policies that restrict what is allowed in schools. Indeed, 31 states have banned the use of corporal punishment in schools. That leaves 19 states which still legally allow spanking in schools. In 2006, over 223,000 students without disabilities received corporal punishment nationwide, 78% of whom were boys. Black students were targeted disproportionately, with over 35% receiving school-based corporal punishment, despite comprising only 17% of the student population. Thinking further about punitive discipline in schools, there has been an increase in the involvement of police in urban public school systems. In 2005, New York City schools saw 4,600 school safety agents and at least 200 armed police officers, making New York City Police Department's School Safety Division the 10th largest police force in the nation. From 2013 to 2014, 20% of all juvenile arrests in Chicago, that's 7,800 kids, occurred on the grounds of Chicago public schools, and over half of these arrested students were under the age of 16. These statistics are not isolated to New York or Chicago, but instead reflect a broader reliance on zero-tolerance policies designed to deter misbehavior. Youth are increasingly being arrested for minor offenses, such as disrupting a class or defying a teacher. Now, the decision of whether or not to decrease punitiveness is theoretically unclear. On the one hand, it's possible that these policies are beneficial by keeping violence at bay. The threat of violence from one's classmates may trigger fear and anxiety among students, which could then inhibit educational outcomes such as school participation and learning. Certainly, studies have indicated that children's test scores may be negatively impacted when their neighborhoods experience violence. So it's possible that the school climate could also impact students' ability to learn. Thus, zero-tolerance policies could have positive impacts on school educational outcomes if the immediate presence of in-school police reduces fights, harassment, and other serious offenses, which in turn then improves the learning environment. Perhaps the hammer of social control through police presence needs to be brought down in schools where the collective capacity of teachers, administrators, and even students to maintain social order feels like it has collapsed. On the other hand, the criminalization of minor infractions of school rules, perceived or real, could lead to unnecessary and unwarranted arrests or increases in youth arrests. Not only could the psychological tax of being arrested and being taken away from school be disturbing, the repercussions of an arrest can stay on one's record long after the arrest has occurred, which can then have long-term labor market consequences. Furthermore, early exposure to the criminal justice system could beget future exposure. But perhaps more concerningly, the system has been found to be skewed in a way that disadvantages racial minorities. The policing of students is disproportionately concentrated in predominantly Black and Latino schools. And in Chicago, for every white youth arrested, there are over 27 Black youth arrested. Now, the question of whether or not the movement towards zero tolerance is sensible public policy needs to be rigorously explored. Thus, it's no surprise that public officials have vacillated from moderate to extreme levels of punitiveness over time. For example, in New York, Before Mayor Bloomberg came into office, there was very little prospect for police in schools. But then during the Bloomberg administration, you see the substantial increase in the number of arrests happening on school grounds. And now in the de Blasio administration, the pendulum has swung, and the number of school-based arrests has decreased substantially. It's not that one administration cares about children more than the other. It's just that everyone is making the best guesses they can with what they know. The changes in policy appear to be driven more by anecdotal evidence and popular sentiment, rather than grounded in rigorous empirical evidence. Historically, parents have sent their children to school with the implicit understanding that teachers serve in loco parentis. And in some situations, that role is now being filled by police officers. It is important to evaluate and understand the effect of these policies on populations about which we care. At Harris, we can leverage being in an urban center, and in partnerships with institutions on campus and in our community, such as Chapin Hall, we can take advantage of new data sources and partnerships with data providers to analyze these issues through rigorous data-driven empirical analysis. By understanding the costs and benefits of a more or less punitive system, we can transform our understanding of optimal ways to teach behavior and help steward policymakers in their decision-making for our public schools, and therefore improve the lives of children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's James Robinson. I'm a professor at the Harris School, and I'm the director of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts. So my task today is just to tell you a little bit about some of the research I've been doing in Africa, which is related to the goals and ambitions and tasks that the Institute has set itself and is setting itself. So I've been interested for many years in problems of African development, and the last 5 or 6 years I've been working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, looking at many different sorts of issues. Now, you probably all know the Democratic Republic of Congo is possibly the poorest country in the world. It's suffered from immense amount of violence, state collapse, immense poverty, enormous lack of infrastructure. We've been working a lot in Kananga in the south of the DRC, according to Wikipedia, the largest city in the world which has no electricity and no running water. So, and I can verify that there is neither electricity nor running water in the city of Kananga. And thinking about the development problems and challenges, collecting data, I've become very interested in how African society works and what you might call social structures in Africa and how they influence politics and policy and public good provision and development. And African society, as you may know or can imagine, is organized quite differently from Western society. And just to give you a flavor of what I mean, let's watch a little video. Now, some of you are probably thinking, didn't he used to teach at Harvard? Perhaps that's a meeting of his old faculty. But actually, it's the end of an initiation of an age set amongst the Mbaka people in the north of the DRC. When boys come of age, they go into the forest and are circumcised and initiated learning the law of their people, and they form age sets. They bond with people, they do collective tasks, they develop a solidarity. And that solidarity, that age set, lasts throughout their life. They do things together, they trade, they do business together, they provide public goods together. They also provide enormous amounts of local accountability for the chiefs and political leaders. So this age set, this organization, is immensely important for the way Congolese society works in that part of the country. I first became aware of the importance of age sets doing research in southern Africa, in Botswana. So Botswana is one of the great economic and political success stories of sub-Saharan Africa. It's radically different from the DRC, but what's interesting about Botswana is it's dominated by a particular people, the Swana, who have very powerful political institutions. And those political institutions, I realized from being at a meeting of a hotla, which is the local assembly where the chiefs come to kind of defend their actions to the people, that young men acted collectively. They acted with solidarity in order to criticize and oppose and make chiefs accountable. And that's deeply connected to the structure of age sets in Setswana, in Tswana society. Go across the border in South Africa. You may know Nelson Mandela back in the 1940s. He was a founder of the ANC Youth League, the African National Congress's Youth League. Now, when I was a kid in England, there were these people called the Young Conservatives. There probably are still. Now, the Young Conservatives are just a sort of social group, basically. It's just an excuse for binge drinking. The ANC Youth League are a serious political organization. They are powerful, they are influential. Why is the ANC Youth League? Why did Nelson Mandela bother creating a youth league? No one remembers who started the Young Conservatives. He did that because in Sotho and Zulu society, age sets, age collaboration are immensely important. He was tapping into part of the social structure of the peoples in Southern Africa. He understood how significant politically that was, and it could be used as an axis of mobilization and political power. So if you want to understand in the northern Congo how things work, how local politics work, how public goods get provided or don't get provided, how conflict resolution takes place, how warlords recruit people, you need to understand how the society is structured and functions. And if you want to figure out how to do something about that, it's immensely helpful to understand these structures and how they work and what they do. Let me finish with another example. As I stand here talking, there's a civil war going on in the South Sudan. The civil war started when, sort of on the surface of it, two gentlemen fell out. President Salva Kiir and the Vice President, Riek Machar. Salva Kiir is from a people called the Dinka. Riek Machar is from a people called the Nuer. The Dinka and the Nuer have a long history, at least 200 years, of fighting each other. And they're also what's known as segmentary lineage societies. These are very different from societies organized by age, like the Mbaka. They're organized through kinship, through lineage. And the interesting fact is, and I've been doing some research on this with a colleague of mine, Nathan Nunn, is that if you look within Africa, there's an incredibly strong association between the presence of segmentary lineage societies and conflict and civil war. So these are just two examples of how, if you want to understand the types of issues that we're thinking about in the Pearson Institute, you need to think about how societies are organized and how that may influence development and conflict resolution. And this is some of the research we're doing. We're doing lots of other things, but that's just one example. Okay.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I'm Will Howell, and I'm pleased to be here. It's an exciting time for the school and for the university. I come to it with expertise not so much in any one particular policy domain, but rather, like the other political scientists and political economists at the school, with an abiding and deeply held concern about how policy is fashioned. For the simple truth is that policy, while informed by data, is too rarely written with best practices in mind, or the latest results of a randomized field trial. It often is crafted in political institutions wherein power is fragmented, fleeting, and contested, and the incentives of decision makers are structured by all sorts of partisan and electoral and institutional concerns. So for the judges and legislators and bureaucrats and executives who actually write policy, who actually fashion public policy, they're motivated in deep ways about the next election, about their capacity to form coalitions, about parties and interest groups and interbranch relations and constitutional and statutory authority, these kinds of things. And these facets of the policymaking process are really at the center of what political scientists and political economists study here at the Harris School. So how do we do that? Well, part of the answer surely involves the collection of data. We scrutinize election returns, legislative behavior, executive vetoes, bureaucratic rulemakings, judicial opinions, for patterns that speak to the underlying forces that shape public policy making, all public policy making, whether it be health or education or national security. But credible data and a well-executed research design are not nearly enough. For the simple truth is that data don't speak for themselves. To make sense of the political world around us, theory is vital. And so I want to speak briefly about the status of theory in the work that we do and how it works in conjunction with the efforts to collect meaningful hard data. Some of the political economists at Harris, for them, the development of theory is a full-time occupation, and rightfully so. For others, myself included, theory serves as a guide and an interpreter of the kind of empirical work that we conduct. It informs where we look, what meanings we assign to findings, and how we understand and implement a research agenda. Let me give you a couple of examples. The first runs as follows. Look, one of the impediments to effective policymaking, it is often thought, is something that is often referred to as the incumbency advantage. The fact that we can't throw the bums out, it is often thought, is cause for so many of our troubles. By virtue of having one office in one moment, it is often thought, elected officials secure all kinds of advantages that protect them from political challenge going forward. And with these advantages in hand, our elected officials lose sight of the public interest, they don't work as hard, and they engage in all manner of graft. Reasons all, it is supposed, for the introduction of term limits, a favorite corrective, an institutional corrective, among some reformers to our sorry state of politics today. Not so fast. In a series of models of electoral competition, my colleagues Scott Ashworth and Ethan Bueneta-Mosquito point to a simple fact, and that is that an important reason why elected officials are reelected at astonishingly high rates, and an important source of the incumbency advantage itself is selection on quality and matching on type. That is the match between the ideological and partisan positions upon somebody who assumes office and their constituents. Voters who are poorly informed about candidate quality, of which there are many, may update their beliefs on the basis of an individual's status as an incumbent or a challenger. And from that kind of updating, certain advantages may flow. So this theoretical insight in hand then set our other colleague, Anthony Fowler, off to try to disentangle what the sources are of why certain people get reelected at such high rates. And by decomposing the electoral returns of incumbents and challengers, he finds that the vast preponderance of the incumbency advantage actually relates to selection on quality and this matching on type, and not the sort of the residual benefits of holding office, which is cause for so much concern. So this is a way in which theory directly informs where somebody looks. Selection can work in other ways as well, informing the behavior of people once in office. And so Chris Berry, and another one of our colleagues, and his former master student, Sarah Anzia, became interested in the varying levels of performance of male versus female legislators in office. So investigating the matter, they find that female legislators in Congress succeed in directing higher proportions of federal largesse to their districts relative to male legislators. They perform better. They're also more likely to sponsor and co-sponsor significant legislations, which is a sign that they may be working harder. Why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons that are potentially in play. What they do is they look for theory. They look across the midway over at the economics department and draw upon Gary Beckard's seminal work on discrimination. And so it runs roughly as follows. Consider a contest between two individuals for an office in which one individual faces a certain level of discretion, a certain level of discrimination that the other one doesn't face. What we should expect is at the margin, those who step forward knowing that they're going to face discrimination are likely to be of higher quality, and those who are conditional upon winning, we should expect them to be of higher quality by virtue of the simple fact that they have to clear a higher hurdle. And that there's nothing essential in this telling of there being male versus female differences in governance and styles of legislating, but rather there's this discriminatory impediment that informs why we have higher quality women in office than men in office. If that's true, right, this theoretical insight is true, then it ought to be the case that if you can find a group of women who didn't systematically face discrimination in assuming office, we shouldn't see them performing at a disproportionately high level. And so what Chris does in this paper, he makes a really smart move, and he says, all right, well, what about women who are widows who assume the office of their husbands who died in office? The story goes that these particular subset of women didn't face obvious levels of discrimination in gaining office, and sure enough, there are enough of them in looking at the data to show that they don't perform especially better or worse than do their male counterparts. One last example, and this comes from my own research involving presidential power. I've long been interested in the capacity of presidents to affect change, policy change, and the conditions under which they're able to do so. And one of the contextual features that I've been interested in investigating is the status of war. I've looked at this figure a bunch of times. I've never seen it so big. So, all right, here's what's going on. All right, so we're interested in thinking about war and whether or not presidents affect change during times of war that they have a harder time affecting during times of peace. What we have here are summary indicators of legislators, members of Congress, their voting behavior, their scores. They just key off of the votes that they cast, such that higher values of these scores indicates more conservative leanings and lower values suggest more liberal leanings. And what I've done here is I've calculated for each member 2 scores which are plotted on the X and the Y axis. On the X axis we have, these are all votes cast in the 107th Congress, which ran from 2001 to 2002. And what I've done is I've calculated, well, how liberal or conservative are members in their voting behavior on all the votes leading up to 9/11, right? And then I said, all right, I've got those. And now I'm going to take for that same person, I'm going to try to calculate how liberal or conservative their voting behavior is after 9/11, but within the same Congress. So we're fixing the institutional context in which they're operating, or we're making comparisons within individuals. And if people are voting the same way in both periods, they should all line up on the 45-degree line, right? And what you see is that systematically they don't. They shift upward, that is, they shift in the conservative direction, and this is looking at just domestic policy legislation. This isn't looking at legislation relating to the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. This is just looking, you see this conservative shift. So why is this? So this is where theory comes into play. There are a number of reasons we might consider that would inform why legislators would vote in ways that would better approximate the ideological dispositions, in this case of presidents in office. George Bush, conservative, higher levels, right? The shift upward is an accommodation to his ideological convictions that we observe in both the House and the Senate. The one that I was drawn to by drawing upon a little bit of theory and recognition of some basic institutional differences between presidents and members of Congress is the nationalization of politics. During war, the terms under which we evaluate policy shifts from parochial to national concerns, and that when that shift happens, there's a greater accommodation of the president who represents the country as a whole. If that's true, then it ought to be the case that during those wars that nationalize our politics, we should see a shift towards the president, and when we don't see a nationalization of politics, we shouldn't see such an accommodation. If you look at World War II and you conduct the same sort of analysis, you see a systematic shift, but it's to the ideological left when FDR is in office. If you look at the Vietnam War, there's not much movement. And it seems to me there's a credible case to be made that the Vietnam War did not nationalize how we talk about policy in ways that World War II and the 9/11 period did. What to say? At each step you see empiricists drawing productively from theory, and more than that, they depend, it seems to me, on theory. And so I want to suggest that theory plays an integral role as we take seriously our charge as members of the Harris community in informing how we do rigorous, serious empirical study. Thank you.
So I'm told we don't have that much time, but I want to ask you guys a couple of questions, if you don't mind. So as I listen to your comments, you studying domestic policy, James studying conflict in the Congo and elsewhere, Will thinking about domestic political institutions, what is the intellectual thread that connects you? You're in the same place. You're in the Harris School, a public policy school. What intellectually unites you? Is there anything about your methodologies seem wildly different? The context studied seem wildly different. Yet I get the sense, I know, that you all fit comfortably within the Harris School. How is that? What connects you?
I think we're all interested in how the world works, and whether it's what policies or programs effectively can accomplish the solutions that we want to tackle really important problems that face society. And moreover, we all appreciate theory and rigorous empirical methods to accomplish to try to answer the questions that we seek to answer and find solutions to. So I think in the end, we all care about public policy and improving the lives of the populations about which we care, and using rigorous methods to try to do that.
Yeah, I think the way I think about it is that although there's lots of policy challenges and issues in the United States, if I thought about the relationship between the United States and Congo or places I study, the United States managed to solve a lot of problems historically that the Congolese have never managed to solve, like how to construct effective, legitimate, centralized political authority. So you learn a lot by looking at both. How did the US solve this problem? Think historically about that. How do these challenges the Congolese face? How can you learn from the history of the United States about how the Congolese could solve these problems, and vice versa? So to me, it's an interplay. So they're all very related, and it's a sort of learning exercise. So I'm just as excited to be in a place where there's people studying the US as I am to be in a place where everyone is just studying developing countries.
I agree with all that. I think that I would just simply add to it that there's a kind of eclectic sensibility of the faculty here. We're interested in what goes on in other disciplines, and we aren't parochial in our own sensibilities. That for me, it's not political science all day long. There's a great deal to be learned from economics and sociology, and so some of it is shared interests, substantive shared interests, and a concern about public policy. But I also think there's an eclectic sensibility that our faculty have.
So one of the things that I've confronted as a faculty member at the Harris School is the occasional pushback from students about the primacy we give data analytics. They say things like, look, are there not some questions that don't lend themselves readily to the kind of thing you emphasize? Fair point. It turns out that one example that presses this point has to do with spanking. Because a kid said to me once, what's the best evidence about spanking? What's the gold standard evidence? Would you randomly spank kids or not? That's what you'd normally say. And if you don't say it in this context, Kerbin, why? Kind of like that. I'm curious about your reaction to that. It's not a well-framed question, but it gets at this point about, do we have blinders on, any blinders as far as you can tell, about how to think about public policy when we think that we focus on a particular kind of evidence as being the most convincing and persuasive kind?
I'll take a stab at this.
Please.
So I start this class that I teach on American political institutions and the policy-making process by saying you've spent a great deal of time trying to think about what the ideal policy looks like, right? And for good reason. There are big questions for which we lack answers, and we should be in the business of trying to furnish answers. But once you have that report with a piece of evidence that you have in hand that's going to convince you what the ideal policy looks like, all your work lies ahead of you. Because you're going to have to engage a bunch of policymakers whose views are about their constituents and about the media and about interest groups and about elections. And so you need to then think about how you effectively navigate this political terrain in order to be an effective leader and an advocate on behalf of that good policy. And I think that's essential when we think about what it means to grow leaders. It's not, what we don't want to do is send master students out into the world only to be frustrated that, damn it, nothing good ever gets done, and we have these sort of weak versions of what ideal policy would look like, but rather to be empowered to see, here's how I can most effectively get stuff done and the conditions under which those sorts of changes are possible.
Any thoughts, Jim?
Well, I think also it's important that if you really want to influence policy, you do need to figure out and understand, or try to understand, how the world works, what motivates people, why do people make the decisions that they do. And there's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of research that is well done. There's a lot of research that also has a lot of flawed methods. And frankly, every piece of research out there has limitations. And I tell my students there's no such thing as a perfect paper. But what's important is there's no way for them to know and to be able to distinguish, well, what's right, what's wrong, what's the nuance in between. And what's great about studying public policy and gaining these tools is, first, as Will alluded to earlier, is that it's important to have a sense of what theories underlie the world, right? Because they can help us really structure our thinking about questions so that we have a model of what the problem is. But then it's important to be able to bring data to bear on whatever issues are. And our students, and at least I've seen this in the students who have graduated and those who have kind of worked in internships, they come back and they say, wow, I feel like I can read the research. And someone said this in a meeting, and actually I went back to some paper and found that actually they were talking about a particular population, or they were studying it using this particular method, which is actually limited to this context. And I think that it helps empower students and empower those who are in positions where they can actually make important decisions to understand what it is that they're talking about and what works and what doesn't and what we actually know about a problem. And frankly, I think that a frustration that I get from students is that they find that it actually raises more questions than answers for them in the long run. But actually, to me, that's part of the success of what we're doing.
I think the spanking thing is interesting. I think there's clearly normative philosophical issues involved in public policy. One of my ex-colleagues at Harvard, who I most enjoyed interacting with, was Michael Sandel, who's a political philosopher, but who's very, very actively engaged in real-world policy issues. And I think you just have to admit that there are ethical, normative questions involved with public policy, not just data. And maybe we should hire some political philosophers. But I wanted to just, in my interaction with policymakers, here's something about data. I'm sort of really struck. I've talked many times to the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And, he's faced with just incredible problems. Everything is a problem. Everything is a challenge. Like, what do I do? And people tell stories and, they have, but okay, I have to make a decision. What do I do? And I think what's very powerful about trying to use data is just, you can't capture every idiosyncratic event or every different characteristic of a society or a context, but you can sort of say, like, well, on average, this is what happens, And I think that's very powerful if you have to make a decision. He has to make a decision. He has to know, should I do it, yes or no? And he can't cope with all of the variation. He just needs to make a decision. And I think that's where data is very powerful for allowing you to make a decision, where otherwise you'd just be caught in endless cycle.
We don't have time for questions from the audience. We'd intended to take some, but we're up against the clock. And so I think I'm going to have to bring our events to a close. I want to thank you for coming to join us. And then I'd like to invite you to join us for a reception in the tented courtyard out back. Be sure to visit the virtual reality tours of the Keller Center, as well as the photo booth. We're going to have special prizes for photos, and I'll give a double prize to the best photo bomb. All right? Thank you all for coming to celebrate the future of Harris, and enjoy the reception.